Growing up, I was a young man, and I'm bisexual, and my best friend brought me out, and his mother kicked me out of the house for corrupting her son. And so I was like the black sheep in town, and yet I was actually the innocent one. And and I thought, how can you treat people that way? You know, I'm a really good person. I help everybody. I still help everybody.
Well, I would, if I did something wrong, I would want to be forgiven. But the thing is, I would do something about it, whatever I did wrong. You know, I wouldn't just go to a priest and say, okay, I did this, okay. You know.
We're all sent with a job, and it's in nobody's place to question that job. Because if you question that job, you're questioning God. And that's absolutely wrong. No one questions God.
It's a little bit more academic than what we've had so far this morning, and it will speak mainly to, and I'm designing it mainly to people who maybe are on the fence, who really are asking the question. You know, that was really a motivating talk, and it's beautiful, and you've telling me that God is love, God is love, God is love. But why should I believe that? Why should I believe that? Last night I kind of gave some of my reasons for believing that there is a personal God. And now we're going further and asking the question, can a thinking person believe that God looks like Jesus, that Jesus actually reveals God? And to me, this is the most fundamental question. This is as foundational as it gets. This to me is everything. My life hangs on this one core conviction, that Jesus Christ is the decisive clue as to what God is like and to what I am like. He reveals true God and true humanity. He does it most essentially on the cross. It wouldn't bother me a whole lot if I'm wrong on every other opinion I have. I've got some passionate convictions about theology and views of the interpretations of this passage or that passage, and you know, I like writing about that and getting involved in it, but I don't have any source of life in any of that. It's not like my sense of worth and self-esteem and fullness of life depends on any particular opinion that I have. And I think that's really an important thing to have, because if that's not the case, then what you have is an idol. We can be idolaters of our own theology when it's a source of life to us. And that's when Christians become jerks, is because now being right is more important than manifesting God's love. All our eggs are to be in one basket, and that is the core conviction about who God is like, that He is as loving as Jesus reveals Him to be. And that says everything we need to know about God, and it says everything we need to know about ourselves. And so the question is, and to me, is that true? And I imagine some people in this room or who'll be watching the video who are wired a little bit like me. Faith has never come easy for me. I've had to really kind of earn the right to believe. My heart can't get behind something my mind doesn't say yes to. And so I've had to really work through a lot of issues in order to arrive at the point where I'm at, where I really am convinced that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, which really just means He's the decisive revelation of God. And so I'm going to share a little bit about why I am convinced that the Jesus story in the gospel is true. And this is just going to be a 25-minute little snippet. There's a whole lot more that could be said about it. I record some of these findings in a book back there called Letters from a Skeptic that I dialogued with my father on these letters. He was an atheist. And over 3 years, I shared some of my reasons for being a Christian. They're also recorded in a book back there that I wrote with a friend, Paul Eddy, and it's called Lord or Legend. And so if you want to go a little further on the historical investigation of the Gospels and why, you know, a thinking person can, I believe, conclude that Jesus Christ is a decisive revelation of God, I encourage you to pick up those books. But here in a nutshell is the way my brain thinks about this. Here's the indisputable facts. This is what everyone agrees with. Sometime in the first third or so of the first century, around 30, 40, 50 AD, there's a band of Jewish folks who went out into the world proclaiming a message. And we know this from a lot of different sources. Some of them are in the Bible, some of them are outside the Bible. But we know that they preached this message that Jesus Christ, who was a contemporary of theirs, lived this extraordinary life to the point where he had a reputation of being sinless. Not many people are going to leave that reputation hanging around. They claimed that he did these miracles. They claimed that he made these outrageous claims, especially for being in a Jewish environment, that he'd come down from heaven and that he was the Son of God. And most importantly, they claimed that he rose from the dead. And they went out into a hostile environment, started in Palestine and then very quickly spread throughout the Roman Empire. And they went out and proclaimed that he's the Savior of the world and suffered a lot of persecution because of it. We know from a Roman historian, Tacitus, that the Christian movement had grown so fast that by the year 62, 63, and 64 AD, the very vicious Roman Emperor Nero could plausibly blame the burning of Rome on these Christians. That's how they were large enough so that people knew who they were, so that Nero could blame this fire that destroyed a lot of Rome. He could blame it on the Christians, saying that the Christians set this fire, and that justified trying to exterminate them. And so he went on this campaign to try to kill all the Christians, and it was as brutal as anything history ever affords us. He made, they called them Roman candlesticks off of some of these Christians, where he'd impale them on a post and then tar them and light them on fire while he was having dinner, and they're his sort of dinner candles. It was so vicious, the treatment, that Tacitus, who's a hardened Roman historian, even he comments in his history that the treatment was barbaric, even by Roman standards. Okay, that's the indisputable fact. We find the basic message of what the early Christians preached in the Gospels and in Paul's epistles, the earliest writings. These folks were willing to die for this message that this contemporary of theirs, Jesus, made these divine claims, rose from the dead, lived this extraordinary life, and did these miracles, verifying the claims that he was making. Now, it comes down to this. And I'm simplifying this a lot because of for the sake of time, but this is the gist of it. Either they're telling the truth or they're not. Either they're telling the truth or they're not. And if they're not telling the truth, well, you have one or two possibilities. Either they know they're not telling the truth, in which case they're lying, or they don't know that they're not telling the truth. They sincerely believe it, they're just mistaken, in which case they're proclaiming a legend. Those are really your two alternatives. If you're going to dismiss the Jesus story as true, you have to believe it's false. And if you believe it's false, you have to believe, ultimately, that either they knew it was false, in which case they're lying, or they didn't know it was false, in which case they're proclaiming a legend. So I want to look at both of those possibilities. Could they be lying, or could this be a legend? Well, let's first look at the lying hypothesis. Could they be lying? Could they have made it up? It's possible. People make up lies all the time. And history gives us a lot of examples of that. So maybe these Christians were just making this story up. But you got to ask a couple questions. Here's one question. Why would they do that? In any kind of trial where you're trying to convict somebody, the most important thing is to prove a motive. Did they have a motive for lying? Well, it's kind of a hard sell to say that they had a motive for lying. What would their motive have been? It's not like these guys gained a lot from propagating this story. I mean, if they would have been, kind of like some TV evangelists and wearing these Rolex watches and driving in these, Mercedes-Benz and living in mansions and having the nice pools and stuff, you might, there be able to plausibly suggest that they were lying. They had something to gain from it. But the trouble is that the disciples had nothing to gain by propagating this story. Nothing. They knew that this story was heretical, by traditional Jewish standards. They knew this would invite persecution. Yet they went out and proclaimed it. They had no motive for making this up. They had every motive for staying silent about it, and yet they went out and proclaimed this. So it doesn't seem like they were lying. But a second thing is this. Even if they had a motive for lying, what it might be, we don't know, but even if they had a motive, could they have pulled off this lie? I mean, think about it. This isn't a story like some of the mythological stories you find in various cultures about a deity who lived long, long ago and far, far away. That's how legends usually read. Once upon a time stuff. Long ago, far, far away. Where? Well, we're not really sure when. Yeah, back then. But it's kind of in the mystical past. But see, the disciples are telling a story about a contemporary. In fact, James, the brother of the guy they're talking about, is part of their crew. They are talking about a story that is in the same vicinity that they're preaching in Palestine. This is a story which can be easily falsified. And there's plenty of people around who want to falsify it. If they're making up a story about a guy who came from Nazareth, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, right here in Jerusalem, there's plenty of people who would say, no, there wasn't. You're making this up. There's no, there was no guy who went around to the hillside preaching and healing people and teaching these things. And you're making this story up. They drop big names like Caiaphas, the high priest. Everyone knows who Caiaphas is. Like Joseph of Arimathea, the man who offered up his tomb. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was really like our Supreme Court in the Jewish world. These are big names. If you want to find out whether it happened, you go and ask them. If this is a lie, it's the easiest falsifiable lie you can imagine, which I think is itself very good evidence that this is not a lie. They would know that they would be vulnerable to being exposed as false very, very, very quickly. So it doesn't seem like the lie hypothesis really flies. And on top of all that, there's just no evidence that these disciples were the kind of people who could lie. There's no evidence that they were lying. And whenever you're going to put forth a historical hypothesis, it's really a good thing to have some evidence for it. A hypothesis for which there is no evidence is a very poor hypothesis. So it doesn't seem like the lying hypothesis is really plausible. And in fact, very, very few scholars accept that. Very few. Which leaves you then one other alternative. And that is that this whole thing is a legend. Could it be a legend? This happens a lot in history. Maybe there's a person who's very impressive in some ways, and stories start to be told about them, and the stories grow. It's the proverbial fish story. The fish gets bigger and bigger and bigger with each telling. And so it's possible that Jesus was some kind of extraordinary guy, maybe even did some sort of tricks, faith healings or whatever. But stories about him grew, and he taps into maybe some cultural longings and some stuff. He's the right person at the right time. And this legend about the Son of God is birthed. That's far more plausible, I think, than that the whole thing was just made up. So is that a plausible theory? It's better than the lie hypothesis, but that's not saying much. Here's a few considerations against the legend hypothesis. I'll give 4. One is that you've got the wrong culture. Not all cultures are equal when it comes to the birthing and propagation of legends. Some cultures are far more prone to that than others. For example, in Western culture right now, legends are hard to birth because people tend to be more critical of them. Whereas that was not the case, say, throughout most of the Middle Ages. We find a lot of legends being birthed, supernatural stories, whatever. People are more gullible towards that. The culture is just on a whole more accepting of that, far more than it is today. What you got to know is that ancient Palestine was probably more resistant to legend making than modern Western culture. And the reason is because Palestinian Jews were Orthodox Jews. Some of the Jews that were outside of Palestine and what's called the diaspora, they tended to be more secularized and therefore more open to legend making and stuff. But the Palestinian Jews, all the evidence indicates that they remained conservative Orthodox, and they were very resistant to legends precisely because all the pagans around them were telling nothing but legends. Their whole religion was about legends and these heroes and gods coming down and whatever. And the Jews were really resistant to that. What we find is that the closer in proximity, at least there's a tendency in this direction, the closer in proximity Orthodox Jews were to pagans, the more Orthodox they became. They had this countercultural mindset. And so if there's ever a culture that would be resistant to the birth of legends and the propagation of legends, it was the Orthodox Jewish Palestinian culture of the first century, especially a legend about a man being God. And I'll say more about that later on. A second problem, and this one is a huge problem. You don't have enough time for a legend. Legends ordinarily, with very few exceptions, legends usually take decades, even centuries, to be birthed and to grow. The legends about Alexander the Great, for example, we find them popping up about 4 centuries after he lived. That's pretty typical. I remember when I first went to the University of Minnesota, I had been a Christian for about a year, and it took about half a semester for me to lose my faith. I talked about that last night a little bit. And one of the classes that caused me to lose my faith was this class in the New Testament as literature, taught by this very critical New Testament scholar. And one of the first days of class, someone in the class said, he was making some point, I forget what it was, but the person in the class said, well, what about John 1:1? That says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And so here Jesus is regarded as God. And the professor kind of chuckled a little bit and stroked his beard. Silly students. He goes, well, you know, Buddha was an atheist. He didn't believe in any kind of God, which is true. And yet we find his followers worshiping him as God. Now, if it's possible for an atheist who doesn't even believe in God to become God to his followers, I don't think it's that much of a stretch to think that Jesus, who believed in God, became some kind of a God to his followers. And I remember sitting in that chair and just the faith just kind of seeping out my pores. It's like, oh my gosh, I put my trust in the wrong religion. Now, here's what I didn't know that I know now. It took about 5 centuries for Buddha to be transformed into a god, not the supreme God. It's a polytheistic culture, but he became a divine being. But it took about 5 centuries for that to happen in a culture that was very conducive to legend making. Well, with Jesus, you don't have 5 centuries, and you don't have a culture that's conducive to legend making. You've got the exact wrong culture, and you don't have 5 centuries, you don't even have 5 decades. Rather, right out of the gate, we find these Orthodox monotheistic Jewish people worshiping Jesus as God, praying to him as God, exalting him as God. The earliest evidence we have is Paul. It's not the Gospels. Paul's writing his epistles around 50 to 62 AD, roughly 17, 20 years after the event. By historical standards, that's being right on top of the event. And he tells us he's passing on traditions. He's not inventing this stuff. He's passing on traditions. And some of the material that most exalts Jesus is in that traditional creedal material that he himself inherited from the Christian community when he joined it 3 years after it was birthed. You don't have 5 centuries or even 5 decades. You really don't even have 5 years. Right on top of this event, when Jesus Christ lived, we find these disciples, Orthodox monotheistic Jews, worshiping him as God. And if there's anything that is antithetical to first century Orthodox Palestinian culture, it's the belief that a human being can be God. Why? Because that's what the pagans believe. So against their most fundamental convictions as Orthodox Jews, they're worshiping a contemporary Jewish person as God. How could you go from an ordinary carpenter to being the revelation of God himself, the embodiment of Yahweh on earth, in a culture that's antithetical to it in the span of, well, basically overnight? That is, I think, the most interesting historical question to ask. And I submit to you, there's no good answer to that question unless you accept that the disciples, in fact, are telling the truth. You got to ask the question, what must Jesus have been like to convince this band of disciples, including his own brother, that he was, against all of their cultural assumptions, the embodiment of Yahweh on earth? He would have to be something absolutely extraordinary. Now, if what the disciples are proclaiming is true, if Jesus lived this extraordinary life and loved the way he said that the way they said that he loved, and did the miracles that he said, and made the divine claims that they said he made, and rose from the dead, if all that is true, well, that kind of explains why they would have this faith that he's the Son of God, and it would take something that magnificent to do it. But if that's not true, if it's a lie or a legend, well, how does that explain anything? The most plausible hypothesis I submit to you is that they were simply telling the truth. A third thing, and I've already kind of alluded to it, is that you've got the wrong culture, you don't have enough time, but thirdly, you've got the wrong story. Legends ordinarily are birthed to fulfill a social need. People need to believe something, and that's what gives force to legends. Usually, legends are birthed in cultures that are in transition, and people are insecure about some foundational values and hopes and aspirations. And legends, in one way or another, they fill a niche. They meet a need. They make people feel more secure. They're looking for a hero. Well, here's your hero. They serve this kind of religious purpose. Or they enforce nationalism. If you've got a nationalistic legend. We got legends about, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, whatever. That's because they reinforce this sort of a nationalistic yes, and so they're birthed in that environment to fit a need. Here's the trouble with this story. Not only does it not meet the needs and fit the assumptions of the culture, as I just said, it flies in the face of the culture in almost every respect. Here they're proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah. Well, the best way to convince an Orthodox Jew of the first century that a guy's not the Messiah is to say he got crucified on a cross, that he's cursed by God. That's not going to sell well in the first century. It just doesn't fit. The framework of the story is out of sync with the fundamental fabric of first century Palestinian culture, which itself is a very strong argument that this is not a legend that we're talking about. It just doesn't have the feel of it. It doesn't meet the needs that legends are supposed to meet. The other thing is that usually in legends, the founders are heroes. The legends are there to hold up some of these folks as heroes. Now, Jesus is clearly a hero of the Jesus story, but everyone else is kind of a doofus head. The apostles, they're never getting it. They're always dull. Jesus calls Peter Satan. Jesus tells them how they're supposed to walk in humility and love one another. And the next verse, they're arguing about who gets to sit next to Jesus in heaven. I mean, they're really extraordinarily dull, which is not the kind of thing that you expect of legends. Usually, if you look at some of the 2nd and 3rd century legends about the apostles, because there are legends about these guys, that happened 2 or 3 centuries later, which is what you expect about legends. Once Christianity got in the pagan environment, which was conducive to legend making, when they start telling legends about the apostles, well, they're all these supermen. I mean, they're like the heroes that legends usually have. And so Peter, for example, is debating Simon the magician in one of these writings, and to prove him wrong, he flies around Jerusalem like Superman. That's the kind of stuff that legends have. The Gospels don't have any of that. As I said, the apostles come across as doofus heads. And the final thing I'll say about the legend hypothesis, and much more could be said about this, but if you submit the Gospels to the same sort of stringent criteria that historians usually submit ancient documents to, in order to try to discern whether it's authentic or not, or whether it's trustworthy or not. There's standard criteria that historians use as they're assessing the veracity of ancient documents. When you apply those to the Gospels, they pass with flying colors. They have all the marks that historians look for in trustworthy ancient documents, with one exception. The Gospels include miracles. And most historians, you take that to be an indication that a document is not trustworthy, because they operate on the assumption that miracles don't happen. And that, I submit to you, is the main reason why in the academic, historical, and New Testament communities, there's not widespread acceptance of these Gospels as authentic. It's because they include miracles, which by definition, for the naturalistic historian, rules them out as trustworthy. But if you're open to the possibility of miracles, in other words, if you don't assume that the story is false at the beginning, then the Gospels give you every reason to accept that they're trustworthy. They pass all the other criteria that historians submit documents to. For example, one of the things that historians look for, and no document passes all the tests equally, these are just the kind of things that we look for, but they look for detail, irrelevant detail. Because if a story is written by an eyewitness or goes back to eyewitness testimony, it usually includes a wealth of irrelevant detail. Because when you're telling a story about something you witnessed, you intend to include information that's not directly pertinent to the point of the story. It's just a matter of historical interest. Well, the Gospels are full of irrelevant detail. In fact, Wolfgang Schadenwald, who to the best of my knowledge was not a Christian, he was one of the top Homer scholars in history, he was invited to give a talk to the theological faculty at Tübingen, which is perhaps the most liberal seminary in the world. And they wanted the testimony of an expert classicist on the Gospels. You know, what do you, as a classical historian, think of the Gospels? And what he said was, and I document this in the book Lord or Legend, but he said, "Never have I encountered, in all my research, such a wealth of vivid detail in such a short span of time as I find in the Gospels." They're just packed with irrelevant detail. Like, for example, Mark, you may not have noticed this, but before Jesus talks, Mark frequently says, he gazed at the crowd around him. It's an irrelevant detail. But it's kind of, he stared the crowd down sometimes before he spoke. Just kind of looked him in the eye, made him nervous a little bit. That's an irrelevant detail. Some of the irrelevant detail is irrelevant, but kind of interesting for other reasons. For example, in Matthew chapter 15, verse 21, Mark 15, Mark says this. He's talking about Simon, who was made to carry the cross to help Jesus because he was falling under the weight of it. And he says, this was Simon of Cyrene, and there's also a lot of names given and places given. Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus. That's really interesting. Because, first of all, it doesn't contribute to the storyline at all. It's just a little historical detail. But what does it tell you? It tells you, he's explaining who Simon is by reminding his audience that this is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Well, that only works if the audience knows Alexander and Rufus. And poor Rufus has a name like a dog. Yeah. But it was a rather common name in the ancient world. And so, clearly his audience, he's writing to an audience that's within one generation of the event. It also tells you that apparently Simon, who was made to carry the cross, somehow ended up becoming a believer because his kids are now in the church. See, it's that kind of detail that historians look for. They tell you, hey, this is an early document, very early, and it's given us this detail, which has all the markings of an eyewitness testimony. What's really interesting is that some of the detail is counterproductive. It's detail that you would have thought the disciples would have left out. Certainly, if they're passing on a legend, let alone making up a lie, it's the kind of detail that they would have conveniently forgot about. They certainly wouldn't have made it up. For example, Herb talked about Jesus' cry on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, he gave a great explanation for why Jesus would say that. But what's really interesting is that it requires an explanation. If you're trying to sell a story that a man is himself God, I'm thinking the last thing you're going to want to admit is that he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" while he was on the cross. And you wouldn't want him on the cross in the first place. But if you're going to have him on the cross, leave all that detail. It's a puzzling detail. It's not going to help you sell your case. What's amazing is that the disciples include it. Now, I think it's one of the most profound details in the entire Word of God for all the reasons Herb gave, because it tells you the depth to which God was willing to sink as a way of reconciling us into himself. But it's not an obvious explanation. The audience would be puzzling, scratching their head on that. The only motive that they could have for including a detail like that is that that's in fact what happened, and they're interested in saying what happened. Here's another interesting detail. Who's the first ones to discover that the tomb is empty? Well, it's women. Where are the guys? They're scared. They're hiding. The first ones to go to the tomb in honor of Jesus is not the guys. They're afraid. It's women. Now, what you need to know is, to use Gina's term, first century culture was extremely misogynist. It was anti-woman. Women weren't allowed ordinarily to testify in court about any crime they saw unless there was a man to corroborate their testimony. In first century Jewish culture, women were seen as being talebearers, liars. And so the last thing you're going to do if you're a Jew writing a Jewish document to Jews is to say that the guys were afraid hiding in the back room and it was women who were the ones who first discovered the tomb. One of the women was this woman who was, it seems, at least in the Gospels, known for her previous scandalous behavior, Mary Magdalene. And she's the one who runs and reports it to the disciples. Of course, the disciples being guys, they don't believe her. So they run to the tomb to check it out. Now, what's interesting, if you read John 20, is that is full of all this detail, irrelevant detail. John, who is a little bit arrogant, calls himself the beloved disciple. Hoo-hoo. But that's a human element, I think, that's in the Bible for a good reason. It tells us that this is written from a very human, authentic perspective. John says that they ran to the tomb, but he got there first. Who cares? But then Peter got there huffing and puffing because he's this burly, fat fisherman. So he then bends to go into the tomb. That's interesting. He had to bend to get into the tomb. Why? Because we know that wealthy tombs, the kind that Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, would have offered, were built low to the ground. And so there's a corroborating little detail there. He bends and looks in. And then the other disciple goes, looks in, and believes. It doesn't say that Peter believed. The beloved disciple believes. And then he looks at the clothes that's there. And some of the clothes is folded up nicely. But the cloth that was around his head is in the corner. Maybe it's the other way around. I forget. But who cares? It's irrelevant detail. But here's Jesus. He rises from the dead and he takes the time to fold some of his clothes. But he doesn't the other one. He throws it in the corner. Why? We don't know. But see, that's the point. This is the kind of thing, as John is recalling what he saw and passing it on in the tradition, he's including all these sorts of irrelevant detail. The point is this, that we have every reason in the world to think that these disciples would not and could not have been lying. Nor do we have any reason to believe that they're passing on a legend. That's a better theory than the lie hypothesis, but it's not a very good theory. Everything, aside from the fact that it includes supernatural miracles, everything else about it testifies that it's passing on true history. And so it forces us with this question. What are you going to do with that? What are you going to leverage your life? You're exercising faith no matter what you do. Now think about this. We always think faith is a religious thing. But actually faith is just a human thing. However you live, you are living by faith. You can leverage everything on the trust, on the hope that the disciples weren't telling the truth, that Jesus Christ is not Lord, maybe that there is no God, and you're going to live a certain way because of that, or you can leverage everything on the faith that they were telling the truth. And now live your life submitted to Jesus Christ. Those really are your options, but you're exercising faith either way. But not all faith is equal. Some faith is more rational than other faith. It takes faith to get on an airplane, but that's a pretty good faith because usually they fly. But sometimes they don't. There's always a little bit of risk involved. But the person who has a fear of flying, they're also exercising faith because they're going to live their life as though planes were never safe. Either way, you're exercising faith. What is your faith going to be? What I want to say here this morning is that the reasonable faith, I believe, is that, in fact, the disciples were telling the truth. And see, if they're telling the truth, then that means this. What Herb was talking about earlier about this outrageously loving God is not just a nice story. It's a story that's rooted in reality. God really does exist, and he really has revealed himself in the person of Jesus Christ. And the same disciples that pass on this story tell us things like this. He was the Word of God. That means the Logos. It's the revelation of God. Whenever God reveals himself, it's going to look like Jesus. He is the image of God, Colossians 1:15. He's the form of God. God takes on a form, Philippians 2:6. Hebrews 1 that we read last night says he is whereas times past God spoke through the prophets in diverse ways, in these last days he's spoken through his own Son, who is the exact representation of his very essence. Everything else was sort of an approximation, little glimpses, here and there. But now God has bet the house. He's come to us himself in the person of Jesus Christ, and he says, here's what I'm really like. Against all of your false conceptions of God, all the things the enemy has told you, all the lies in your head, all the assumptions that you've had, all the things you think you know about God, wipe them all away, because here's what God really is like. He's a God who will leave the bliss of heaven, become a human being, die a hellish death on the cross. Why? Because he's absolutely madly in love with you and wants to spend eternity with you. That's the true God. That's the real God. That's what he's really like. That kind of outrageous love. Amen. If you understand the gospel story in its original environment, it is the most beautiful beautiful love story that could ever be told. One of the final things I'll say about why I believe this is that apart from the historical evidence, I came to the conclusion, as I said last night, that there was a personal God, and there must be some purpose to life. If there's a personal God, he does things purposely. So I don't think this is all an accident. But what is the purpose of life? And I think anybody who's got any healthy bone in their body will know that it has something to do with love. If there's a purpose, it has something to do with love. Well, this story, apart from the historical facts now, this story is the most incredible love story ever told. About a God who crosses an infinite distance and suffers the opposite of himself. God made him to be sin, who knew no sin. He goes to the furthest extreme imaginable for a beloved who could deserve it less. It is the greatest love story ever told. And so intuitively, there's something in me that says, okay, that whether it's true or not, that story represents, on a gut level, I feel like life should be about. It has a ring of truth. And now, as you look at the historical data I submit to you, you have every reason to believe that that story is in fact true. And now everything is explained. You can know why you think that love is the purpose for everything, because you're made for love. You're created for love. You're created out of a God of infinite love for the purpose of dancing forever in that infinite love. And this is how God expresses his infinite love towards you. You could not right here, right now, no ifs, ands, or buts, be more loved than you are right now. God burns in his love towards you with the very essence of his being. He doesn't have a secondary love or an accidental love or a quasi-love towards you. His love doesn't waver based on your performance or anything of the sort. His love is expressed on Calvary, and that was for you. No ifs, ands, buts, or take-backs. The only remaining question is, will you open up your heart to that? And let yourself be loved like that? Because the promise, as we started this talk off with, is this. If you'll just accept that, the love of Christ will compel you. You'll find yourself being changed. Your desires change, your life changed, your perspective changed, and now you're beginning to enter into life as God always intended us to live it. Open your heart up to him.